We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Doomberg, head writer for the Doomberg team. How are you today, Doomberg?
Tom, I'm doing great. How are you, my friend?
I'm excellent. It's always a good day when I get to speak with you. And we're gonna talk about a couple topics today that are as important as always. But I think some of the framework of how we're going to be thinking about a lot of these ideas today are especially not only relevant but meaningful in this time. But I'd like to start by chatting a little bit about, let's say, what Trump has actually accomplished so far. He's 58 days into his presidency as of the day that we're recording this. So why don't we start there and kind of go through what Trump has actually accomplished so far?
I think by any objective measure, Trump's first 58 days have been a whirlwind. The man had 4 years to contemplate his comeback, to ponder what went wrong in his first term, to think about all of the challenges that confronted him. I think mostly unfairly. I think his first presidency was effectively sabotaged, both from within and without. Mm-hmm. And contrary to his inauguration and first 100 days in 2017, I think Trump has accomplished far more than anybody thought possible, something we had warned about in a few pieces prior to the inauguration. And to be totally fair to Trump, he's doing precisely everything he said he would do in a series of videos that he published in 2023 and 2024 called Agenda 47. And so I think for one of the rare times in history, a politician ran on a platform and he is aggressively seeking to implement virtually everything he promised to do. I say virtually, there's a few notable exceptions. He has accomplished almost everything through executive action, which has its pluses and its minuses. In the plus category is the speed with which such things can be done, notwithstanding the judicial hurdles that are sort of being put in his place, which we could probably talk about. Mm-hmm. But the downside is they're less permanent. They can be undone by a successor, as Trump is proving, by undoing many of the things that Biden has done. And then in the long term, we do think about and are concerned about the whiplash effect. Many of the industries that we cover, especially the heavy commodities and so on, have a planning cycle and a capital expenditure cycle that is longer than 4 years. And as much as we think investments in wind and solar were wasted, it's wholly unfair to the companies in that supply chain to go from, the most important thing in Washington to the least important thing in Washington in the span of 2 months between the election and the inauguration. Mm-hmm. Such whiplash and the sort of hysteresis effect that comes with repeatedly doing that, I think does in the long term create a bit of a moral hazard. The old adage being that capital goes where capital is respected. And no matter how pro-capital you might seem, it is integrated over time. Anti-capital has sort of anti-capitalistic effects if planning cannot be counted upon. And so if J.D. Vance doesn't win in 2028 or his, whoever succeeds Trump on the Republican ticket and we get, Gavin Newsom back in the White House, are we really just going to flick the switch the other way? So I'd say on balance, doing as he said he would do with pretty good impact, a vast difference in feel, communication style, and cadence than the Biden administration. I think it's just undeniable, mm-hmm. But not without its controversies as well.
Well, obviously one of the, let's say the biggest things that is, let's say, on the mind of people in this space is the national debt. Some of the problems that his team is facing, like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, is having to decide how to roll the $6.7 trillion of debt that is coming due this year. So do you see this as being a challenge because of Yellen issuing more short-term debt over the last 4 years than normal?
Yeah, I would say that history will not be kind to Janet Yellen and the manner in which she postponed the reckoning that was accumulating in the post-COVID era. We've done a couple of pieces on this. One, perhaps with the controversial title, "The U.S. is not broke." The U.S. is facing a fiscal refinancing challenge, but over time, of course, the U.S. has enormous assets to deploy, and Scott Bessent is, I think, uniquely qualified to see the problem and to handle the problem over time. The big issue, of course, is just as we talked about, the life cycle of politics is such that a major recession, which is largely needed and I think forthcoming, is something that is politically difficult to navigate and might lead to that flip of a switch in 2028 that we talked about. So to bring everybody listening who may not be as familiar, Janet Yellen basically front-loaded the maturity curve of the U.S. government debt in a way that is not inconsistent with how emerging market economies do just before a debt crisis and a spiral. And a lot of that debt is now coming due and needs to be refinanced. And Bessent is finding that the market appetite for what's known as terming out that debt, in other words, replacing, say, a 1-year bond with a 10-year bond, is just not there. And since basically the entire global financial system is anchored to the 10-year Treasury yield, any spikes in that number are carefully watched and guarded against, not just at the Fed, but with other central bankers around the world as well. Mm-hmm. So there's tools for him to use, but it is a significant challenge made worse by the fact that she drained other liquidity tools as well, basically leaving nothing in the cupboard for her successor, and trying to paper over the sort of holes in the economy up and until the election. Of course, the election didn't go their way, which is what it is. But yeah, I would say that Janet Yellen's legacy as Treasury Secretary will be viewed by historians as a relatively irresponsible one.
That's a generous way to put it, I think.
Yes, so, indeed.
You know, are there strategies that are being implemented or at least talked about that really help this situation? You know, like let's say the creation of a crypto reserve, despite how gold bugs might feel about it, does that provide some meaningful appetite for U.S. debt?
I mean, it could. So how would that work for those, again, that don't study this as closely as you and I do? You can't really participate in the crypto universe without first parking some fiat in the form of a stable coin. So you would exchange US dollars for Tether, say. And then with your Tether tokens in hand, you go about transacting in your favorite, meme coin or Bitcoin, or pick your favorite cryptocurrency / digital asset. And what Tether then does with your hard-earned fiat is they park it in short-term treasuries. And so in a world where the White House, through the creation of a crypto reserve, or even the president issuing Trump coin, creating a frenzy in the crypto space, and a spare $1 trillion or two finding its way into that market would serve the president just fine, because that's, $500 billion or $1 trillion worth of short-term bond demands that would not really need to find a new buyer, and a steady bid in the form of stable coins would at least alleviate part of the problem. And these are problems of degrees, of course. There is an appetite for 10-year bonds, and there is an appetite for, short-term paper. It's just a matter of getting too far out of balance, and then, the system sort of goes into crisis mode. And so every little bit counts. But we view that, one of the mental models that we have is that the overarching need to get a firm and rapid grip on the U.S. fiscal situation is driving a lot of Trump's behavior, and in fact might even hurt his ability to rein in spending, because if you rein in spending, you trigger a recession. So, which is what's happening right now, that plus the tariffs. And so there is going to be a crunch period. And I think Team Trump has decided, even though they haven't said it explicitly, they hint around it enough that you can read between the lines. They're going to have a short and deep recession early. in the hopes that the recovery on the backside leans into the midterm elections.
Right. That would make sense because, the situation as you touched on, that they've been left, there doesn't seem to be any choice to be able to get around the matter.
Well, Trump wants to completely rewire the U.S. economy, and you can't do that without breaking it.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Breaking the existing systems.
Correct. That's what he's doing. I think it's meaningful for people to be aware of it. I mean, tariffs are causing a recession. We haven't written this yet. It's not, we knew that probably wouldn't be a recession before the election because of all of the tools at Yellen's disposal and the fact that natural gas was dirt cheap. Natural gas has tripled from the bottom and there's no tools left. And the tariffs are causing supply chains to seize. Last time we saw something like this was during COVID, and we had a recession during the COVID period. And we came out of it strong, by the way. I mean, look, this obsession with preventing recessions has accumulated so much junk in the economy that you do need a flush at some point. I mean, it's called creative destruction for a reason. That doesn't mean that people won't be hurt. But I think if you sort of zoom out, the three-part strategy for Team Trump is break everything now, sterilize the resulting deficit one more time, signaling to the market that this is the end of it. What do I mean by that? The Fed basically provides the marginal bid for the deficit that arises from a drop in receipts, and then destroy the regulatory state such that on the back end, when you come out of that recession, you see a boom of historic proportions. And the market could probably price through all of that, and it might just work. But that, I think, is truly the only really viable option to avoid a hard landing, given the cards that this administration was dealt.
Mm-hmm. Bessent had also mentioned monetizing the asset side of the balance sheet. So if they revalue gold to today's market value, that would equal, about $750 billion. Is that, to me, that doesn't seem to be like or maybe not to me, but people point to that and say that it's not really a meaningful amount. So what else is there to monetize?
Well, it would be a meaningful amount with gold at 30,000, wouldn't it? I mean,
then that would be $7.5 trillion, right?
Which is a quarter of the debt and plenty of deficits to fund. But the U.S. has an incredible array of assets beyond gold. We chronicled some of them in our piece called "The U.S. is Not Broke." 640 million acres of real estate, some of which is incredibly prime. Billions of acres of offshore, all manner of oil and gas resources buried or under the ground or in the control of the U.S. government. Even Trump's, gold card, I've seen some pushback on this, but at $5 million a pop, it would only take 300,000 people willing to buy U.S. citizenship to fund the deficit for a year. There's probably a lot of wealthy people or corporations that might want to buy such cards for their executives. Mm-hmm. It's been tried before with mixed success, but it's never really been tried with the United States, which, for all of its problems, is still a prime destination for the wealthy in the world. So I think there's a path out, and there's even a growth path out. I do think that the U.S. federal government and some of the state governments in the big economies in the country have just gotten completely out of control, and this suffocates capital, and it stunts economic growth. I mean, the fiscal spending in Washington kept the economy out of a recession in 2024. This is sugar highs, right? I mean, these can't last forever, and like any drug addict, you get less of a high with the same dose over time. And somebody has to fix it. Maybe Trump will be the person. He seems intent on trying.
Well, there's a big combination here of the implementation of tariffs and also tax changes, not necessarily, just tax cuts, but tax changes. So let's take that particular piece right now. What are some of the changes that are on the table at the moment?
Well, one of the challenges is that a lot of this is done in back rooms and then presented as a finished product in an omnibus bill. And that doesn't seem to be changing, much to the chagrin of the Freedom Caucus in the House. And so it's difficult to say what's on the table. I know there's talk about closing the infamous carried interest loophole. We talked about it in our piece. It wouldn't take much in the way of tax collecting for a significant dent to be made in the deficit. The U.S. Collects something like 17% of GDP in the form of tax receipts, which in the developed world is actually quite low. And for each percent of GDP that you increase in collections, you do the math, we're running 6% or so of GDP as a deficit, while 1% more collection is 15% of the deficit. And Europe, by contrast, collects something like 25% of GDP from its citizens. Now, that comes at the expense of growth, of course, but it's there as a possibility. And as much as the rich pay a huge proportion of the taxes already, we do live in a wildly asymmetric income inequality world in the U.S., where the ultra-rich don't pay much in the way of taxes. They might pay a greater share of the taxes, but in aggregate terms, as a percent of their income, for example, they tend to have good attorneys and trust planning and so on to avoid taxes as much as possible. It's a very high ROI investment to make at that level of wealth, and that's why they do it. And politicians can be bought on the cheap to allow them to do it. But just to give you a sense of the sort of getting the hands around the problem, in 2024, fiscal year 2024, the federal government collected as much money as it spent in 2019, just 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And by the way, 5 years ago, the government was a bloated mess of fraud and waste too. So you can't tell me that the extra, $2 trillion and change we've added to federal spending is all wonderful, prudent use of taxpayer money. But I think the more important than tax changes is whether or not DOGE will be effective and whether or not the cuts that have been identified will be followed through upon and then hardwired into future spending patterns. Because I could tell you from experience in this article that we published called "The U.S. is Not Broke" on February 13th, I come from the private sector and have been through many workouts, where the solvency of a business unit or even a whole corporation is in question. I managed through the global financial crisis like so many others. Zero-based budgeting works. You can literally stop all spending and only add back what is truly needed. And if we did that with the federal government, I can assure you that we would be able to cut spending in half and hardly anyone would notice it. People will throw up their hands and say, oh, you're going to hurt the poor, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much waste and mismanagement. Anybody who's interacted with the federal government knows it. Even Medicare and Social Security are ripe with fraud. If we truly clean things out, like one small thing you could do is just make every person currently receiving Social Security reapply for it and prove they're living, right? The systems exist to do this. I bet you'd cut Social Security spending by 20% with just doing that. Medicare fraud is enormous. Look, every $100 billion counts.
It all ends up adding up.
Of course, yes. The Health and Human Services budget is $2 trillion. It's crazy. So anyway, I digress. And by the way, all thanks to Obamacare, which was supposed to make, health costs cheaper.
Well, Elon and DOGE are making a lot of waves and a lot of people upset. But I think, this is meaningful. This is a meaningful way to move forward in the world, to be able to at least look at how these tax dollars and deficit dollars are being spent.
Yeah. The private world has to do that all the time. Look, every time we publish a piece, our financial future depends on it. I mean, if we do well, we make more. If we do poorly, we make less. If we make a catastrophic mistake, it could cost us our business. Mm-hmm. And, this isn't the first business we've tried to start, and we lost 85% of the business we had built heading into COVID. There was nobody there to backstop us. We had to reinvent ourselves, and we did. And Doomberg came out of that, and thank God it did. That's creative destruction. The business we have now is way better than the business we had built that we were mourning when COVID killed it. Mm-hmm. But this is the dynamic nature of capitalism, and none of that happens in government. I mean, my own personal experience with the government, for a variety of reasons, has led me to become totally disillusioned with it. And so you can't tell me that a zero-based budgeting effort, one department at a time, wouldn't cull at least half of what's being spent in Washington. Just look at the EPA with this $20 billion. I can't believe there's anybody on the Democratic side who doesn't believe that that was basically theft and that it shouldn't be brought back into the public treasury, that people are suing to defend the misappropriation of funds at this scale. It tells you just how corrupt Washington has become. I mean, $20 billion, I would bend over to pick that up if I came across $20 billion on the sidewalk. I mean, I don't know about you, but that's a big chunk of change. And to just rush it out the door, tossing gold bars off the Titanic or whatever that guy who got caught on film describing it as, it's truly shocking that half of the political spectrum defends that. Mm-hmm. It shows you just how far we have to go.
Well, when your job is to, keep the existing system in place, of course you're not going to want that system to change.
Yeah, I mean and I think the whole USAID thing is the Band-Aid that needs to be pulled, and take a look and see at the wounds under it. I think that it's very clear that there was what effectively amounts to money laundering, where there's this whole ecosystem of NGOs being funded by USAID at the point source, and all manner of six-figure salaries were being paid to predominantly Democratic-connected political operatives, who then kick back a portion of that salary to the campaigns of the same politicians who funded them in the first place. And the circular nature of that, if DOGE only does one thing, breaking that, I think would be pretty interesting to see what happens. Mm-hmm. Because there's no way, like the Scott Jennings, who's sort of come out of nowhere to be a fascinatingly interesting person to watch on CNN as an analyst, frame things correctly. Like, whatever you think of Trump, and we have our issues with Trump, he is mastering the 80-20 issue. Like, if 80% of the people support a certain issue, he's loudly for it. And because his opponents are, reactively anti-Trump no matter what, they find themselves defending 20% popular issues across the whole political dimension right now. And he's running circles around them. I mean, again, to defend what happened at the EPA, or to think that we should be funneling $60 billion to foreign media operations and disrupting the political stability of countries all over the world is just indefensible. To think that there's no waste at the Pentagon, for example. By the way, that's going to annoy many people on the right, but there's an enormous amount of waste at the Pentagon. They can't even pass an audit. There's hundreds of billions of dollars stolen. We should be outraged by it. That should not be a partisan issue. And so, he's putting them on their back foot for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you and I have talked about many times, and you frame quite succinctly, energy is life. And the last time you and I spoke, we were talking about incoming Energy Secretary Chris Wright. So what have been the meaningful changes on the energy side of things that are, likely to actually make things better?
I would begin by saying that, in our view, Chris Wright is the single best cabinet selection that Trump has made. And we were very pleased that his nomination passed largely without controversy. Mm-hmm. And he managed to get confirmed with a few Democratic votes. It wasn't nearly as bipartisan as we would have hoped. But that is the sort of the brightest aspect of what Trump has done. We are, I'd say, know him is too strong of a word. We were on a podcast together and exchanged a few emails before he became the nominee, and read his work. And he's the CEO of Liberty Energy, and wrote a white paper that would be indistinguishable from a Doomberg missive. And so, of course, we're naturally attracted to his stance. I think just the signaling power of knowing that the administration is open for business again within the constraints of the whiplash effect that I talked about earlier is itself bullish for energy supply. In tangible terms, the flurry of executive orders have made it possible for the energy industry to gain access to assets that were, hidden by Biden's pen, or put under lock and key by Biden's pen. Most tangibly, the LNG export ban on new LNG export licenses has been lifted, and we noted with interest that Chris Wright was celebrating the commission of Venture Global's new LNG facility along the U.S. Gulf Coast. And so there will be far more LNG plants brought online. I think we're going to see a wave of new supply. We get a lot of pushback from people saying the industry won't invest and so on. And I think that's just, well, wish casting by people who are long energy. They're going to produce more. They're going to try to refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Trump will cut a deal. He wants to bring oil prices down, both to put some pressure on Russia, although that's probably a little too late, but also to spur economic activity on the back end of the recession and the boom he's trying to create. And so I think the trade will be long-term access to valuable assets in return for lower oil prices. And I think that's the deal he's going to cut. Chris Wright says and does all the right thing. In fact, we noted with interest just yesterday, he was quoted in one of the major papers saying that energy is life, which is a phrase that we have popularized, and we're more than happy to allow him to use it. But so I think he is a shrewd business person who understands the fundamental nature energy plays in our economy, and is a powerful symbol of the business-friendly nature of this government. Again, 4 years away from a whiplash, but for now at least, that's the effect that we see.
Well, and the last time you and I spoke, we talked about this idea that he's one of the only Treasury or energy secretaries that actually has experience in the energy sector.
He's the most qualified Secretary of Energy in the history of the nation. Yeah, there's just no doubt about it. Certainly compared to his predecessor, who was busy proclaiming that we should build electric tanks. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about Jennifer Granholm.
Mm-hmm. So, Doomberg, let's go back to this idea of tariffs. Is this going to be, let's say, a meaningful source of revenue going forward? This seems to be obviously a gigantic topic and something that is very contentious, basically affecting the rest of the world.
Yeah, because the entire world is and has been built upon the hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing. And because of the hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing, there's huge trade deficits. And when you have huge trade deficits, tariffs become a viable revenue source for you. And reciprocal tariffs don't hurt you as much. We have many friends in Canada, and we understand the level of anger and the propaganda that is proliferating throughout that country. And I'm sure we'll talk about the call we made on Mark Carney many months ago. That looks pretty prescient now. But just to put some numbers on it, the U.S. imports about $4 trillion of goods a year and only collected $77 billion, or 2% of the total, in tariffs last year. If that number were raised to 20 to 25% across all goods, which is not on the table, but I'm just giving you this for back of the envelope, all things being equal, that's about $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a meaningful dent on the refinancing risks that are currently facing the U.S. Treasury. So some portion of tax increases, tariffs, reduced spending, revaluing some of the assets, monetizing the balance sheet, that's the sort of the mix of things that the government is going to do. And then the hope is that the bond market will see this as meaningful progress and bring rates down naturally, which will then give them the breathing room they need, to execute Kyle Bass's famous trick, which is, of course, a rolling loan collects no loss. And so we don't really have a solvency crisis. We have we're well beyond that. We have a refinancing crisis at this point. And that's what the administration is urgently facing.
Mm-hmm. Well, you brought up this idea that there's basically this trade war developing between Canada and the U.S. We've seen former head of the Central Bank of England and Canada, Mark Carney, replace Justin Trudeau for prime minister recently. And Trump said that he would find a liberal leader easier to work with than a conservative leader. So you recently made the point in that article about Canada that Thinking laterally requires a willingness to challenge assumptions, connect disparate facts in unconventional ways, and even occasionally entertain the absurd as axiomatic. So, what are some of the ways that we need to be thinking about this situation that aren't immediately obvious?
So, lateral thinking is a form of thought that is different than sort of traditional linear thinking, as the title would imply. And most people are comfortable thinking linearly. To think laterally requires either the natural ability to do so or specific training. And there are tools and techniques of the trade that work quite well. And I think one of the things we do well here is we tend to think laterally about issues, and we're not afraid to put them out through our masthead. And if we're wrong, we're wrong. But occasionally we put out a thought that looks pretty prescient, like we did in early December in a piece we published called Alberta Clipper. We speculated on the future of Canadian politics and most importantly for us, the potential impact on energy markets, given Alberta's outsized role in global energy markets. And in that piece, we predicted, at that time, conservatives were 90% plus favorite to win the next election, and you couldn't even bet on Carney in the betting markets to be prime minister or to win the election. And here we are now, almost like magic. He replaced Trudeau, and Polymarket gives him a pretty decent chance of winning. And I think the momentum is clearly on his side. Why did we think that would happen? Well, Carney's a globalist delight. And our experience in Canada is it's got the mirage of a democracy, but Canada is really controlled by a dozen or so very powerful families. I mean, you have to look no further than New Brunswick and the Irving family. Like, do you think elections really matter in New Brunswick? Of course they don't. And it's the same across Canada. And Carney is just a globalist delight. He's literally a member of every society that has become sort of fodder for quote unquote conspiracy theories, and head of the Bank of Canada, head of the Bank of England. There's still a very strong relationship between Britain and Canada and the other sort of former British colonies, Australia, for example. And so Carney is just like the perfect candidate. And so one of the models that we had developed, which is sort of a classic example of lateral thinking, is long before it became obvious that Trump was serving the interests of the globalists and then would work to have Carney installed. And now he's all but said it. Again, we put this out in December, but that's one of the examples of when such thinking would work. And so as we watched Trump in January and with the whole, we had a hunch that when Trudeau met Trump in Mar-a-Lago, that the sudden explosion of 51st state and governor talk might have had an ulterior motive. And we began to wonder whether Carney might not be that motive. Now, look, if you're a mega American listening to this, you might recoil at the thought that Trump is doing the bidding of the globalists. And maybe for a variety of reasons we don't understand, that's a trade he was willing to make. For example, he got something on the back end that is not explicit in the trade. But it sure seems like he's trying to install Carney, and I think he's going to be successful. And so, as we said in the piece, such models need not be right; they just need to work. And by work, we mean explain recent events and predict future ones. And the moment it stops explaining future events, you discard the model for a better one. And then in that piece, we went on to explain why the frenzy in Europe, for example, might have solved another problem of Trump's that had nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. So I think. In this case, being willing to have any axiom and then observing the data against that axiom to see whether it might not fit better than conventional wisdom. Look, it is amazing that virtually every media frenzy over time, with hindsight, was completely fabricated. I mean, just look at all of the confessions about lab leak theory now that we see, right? So whatever the media is hyperventilating about, there's almost always something different behind the scenes that's actually going on. And so we don't know why it'd be any different today. We have two major frenzies going on in the world right now, at least the world that we follow. One is in Europe over Trump's call with Putin, and one is in Canada over the whole 51st state talk. And both have a person in the middle. His name is Donald Trump. And I presume that these are not random actions.
Well, to that point, there was a story going around that Carney was brought in because Canada was in probate and is being liquidated in order to join the US. What weight do you think that story holds?
Very low. First of all, hadn't read it. I think Carney is brought in because he's like the perfect candidate. He's the perfect candidate for everyone in Canada to rally around, and for them to think that he is actually leading the country. I mean, back to our original point. I mean, having been in and around both the U.S. and Canada for many decades, you begin to develop some patterns. And look, the Liberal Party in Canada is very strong. It's a key element of the fabric of the ethos of the country. The media there is effectively controlled. It's not how Canadians like to view themselves, of course, but I was texting with a friend who happens to live in Canada, and they made a few statements, and I asked that person, like, stop and think about, when did you come to believe that and why? Mm-hmm. Like, what do you care about who rules the Donbass, for example? Like, why are you emotional about who currently rules the Donbass? You have no personal ties to the area. You care about it because the media told you to care about it. Why do you not care about what's going on in the Congo? There's a very vicious war going on in the Congo, and most of the world's cobalt comes from there. And in many ways, it's certainly, as measured in the human tragedy, just as meaningful as what's going on in Ukraine, but nobody talks about it. Why don't you care about that? Well, both questions can be traced back to the box in your living room told you to care about it. Why? Like, just start pondering those things. It's difficult for people to do, but like, the entire country of Canada, with some exceptions in the West who probably see through what's going on, have been whipped into a frenzy of groupthink that should give anyone who lived through the COVID era PTSD. Mm-hmm.
There was also an idea that was brought up about Canada issuing US denominated bonds and Europe buying those bonds. Is this something that would be out of the ordinary, or a way to, let's say, undermine Trump's success at this time?
Yeah, we read those reports as well. Canada is not going to win a trade war with the US. And there are very few tools that Canada has at its disposal to meaningfully change the arc of what Trump is trying to do. If Trump truly wants to crush the Canadian economy, he has the leverage to do it. I don't think he will. And in fact, in the piece, a natural extension of our model is that once Carney gets his feet on the ground, Trump will hand him an early wind of a reasonable negotiated settlement on tariffs just ahead of the election, and all is well, that ends well, and the Liberals will be swept back into power with a comfortable majority. I mean, he was on Fox News last night saying he wants to deal with a Liberal, and that the conservative candidate is not a real conservative. I mean, he's doing all he can to put his finger on the scale. Like, it's overt, it's not even subtle. And so, I think classic Trump negotiation tactic is to say something completely wild, get a little more than he probably would have gotten, and then even allow his opponent to sort of shape it as a win. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what he's doing with Carney.
So, Doomberg, how do you think that this lateral versus linear way of thinking also extends to the Ukraine conflict and, let's say, the U.S.'s relationship to Russia at this moment?
Yeah, so this is, again, a bit controversial for people because we've all been told that this war is one thing when it's probably not quite that thing. It almost never is exactly as it's described, and the Ukraine war is no different. Trump, again, back to our original model of wanting to cut government spending. You can't really cut government spending in a meaningful way without cutting defense spending, but you can't really cut defense spending without annoying a whole bunch of really powerful people, namely the military-industrial complex. And as we like to say, when you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem. And so Trump wants to get out of Ukraine. He, for some strange reason, wants to go to war with Iran. And he would like a natural bidder for U.S. weapons. And if Europe could arm itself, wouldn't that be great? Well, what better way to get Europe to arm itself than to convulse it into a panic over the prospect of pulling out of Ukraine, cutting a deal with Putin, and maybe even leaving NATO. And suddenly you see all of Europe rushing to spend $1 trillion to rearm itself. Well, who do you think the major beneficiary of that's going to be? I mean, there's lots of talk about buy European, yada, yada, yada. They're going to buy American weapons. And so you cut $100 billion out of the Pentagon's budget, and you create $200 billion worth of incremental demand in the rest of the world through proxy wars in the Middle East and so on. And then you cut a deal with Putin. Who knows? Maybe even the famous Russian reserves that have been frozen. Maybe Putin decides as part of the grand deal that the U.S. gets a refund on everything it's spent in Ukraine. And suddenly, I mean, again, the absurd can become axiomatic, and then you could just see whether it makes sense. Like, I think there's probably a scenario where directly or indirectly that happens. Like, Trump is very clear. He wants out of Ukraine. He wants Europe to rearm, and he would like his money back. Right? And so there's a solution, right? Mm-hmm. I was arguing with somebody yesterday that one of the things a significant pullback from NATO might do is to make Russia think that peace is possible. Because right now, Russia's demanding sort of hardwired fixes to what they would call the root causes of the problem. Well, the root cause of the problem in their eyes is, the encroachment of the NATO powers closer and closer to Russia. Mm-hmm. If the U.S. pulls out of NATO, that solves the problem for Russia. Now, we can't technically pull out of NATO, although I think the law that prohibits him from doing so, which was passed in 2023, is probably unconstitutional. But he could certainly de-emphasize it to the point of making it immaterial, which he seems to be doing. And so, and I don't think Russia is afraid of a rearmed Europe. It's going to take way too long. Most of it's going to be wasted, and it's going to be seen for what it is, which is a backdoor way to keep the U.S. military-industrial complex fully funded while the U.S. government fiscal situation gets put under control. So again, when you think sort of laterally and you ponder what, when you eliminate all of the impossible things, only the possible ones remain, no matter how crazy they are. And I think, for example, just look at the territorial demands of Russia and Ukraine. Well, one way to make that happen is to simply let the Russian military succeed in their land objectives by stopping aid to Ukraine and maybe even freezing intelligence sharing, and suddenly the lines collapse. And then, the ceasefire is now implemented across a line that is more suitable to the Russians and in a way that isn't negotiated. And so nobody has to accept it because it's been implemented by force. Right? These are difficult for people that are emotionally attached to something as visceral as a war to see. But, 10 years from now, I think it'll be something along those lines will probably be what's being discussed on these infamous phone calls between Trump and Putin. I mean, the Russians are clearly engaged, and the most angry people, as they should be, are the Ukrainians, because they have been treated poorly from start to finish in this entire affair. But nonetheless, I mean, this is what great powers do, and I think you sort of have to analyze the pieces on the board.
So I want to go back to this idea of leaving NATO and, let's say, disbanding NATO. Is this an idea that, as you said, it provides, let's say, it in a way almost appeases everyone if the U.S. is able to sell more weapons to Europe, and this also gives Russia a feeling of security? Does this, in some ways, is this a win on all of the important levels?
Yeah, I mean, again, that as crazy as it might sound, right? Like, so what's not going to happen is the following: Putin and Trump negotiate a treaty, and it passes the U.S. Senate. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to happen. It will require a 2/3 vote. Half the Republicans will vote against them. All the Democrats would vote against anything that Trump brings up. And so that's just not going to happen. He's not going to get 2/3 of the Senate to approve a new treaty. So you just have to defang the one treaty that is of most concern to Russia, and you have a deal. By the way, it's not like Trump's ever been happy with the Europeans or the NATO deal. He says openly the European Union was built to, quote, screw America. Let them defend themselves. And if we could sell them the weapons to do so, all the better. And so I headline hit last night that the U.S. is considering no longer, accepting the role of supreme commander of NATO forces in Europe. Well, this is all sort of consistent with the trend. Now, again, as I was reminded by a friend, he can't just withdraw from NATO specifically because the Congress passed a law in 2023 that would forbid a president from withdrawing from NATO without the support of Congress and the same two-thirds majority. I think he can effectively withdraw from NATO, if not in title, then in action. And that seems to be what he's trying to do. Because look, without the US, there is no NATO. I mean, it's 75% of the military spending of the NATO countries happens in America. Mm-hmm. And at least half of the other 25% is sourced directly from America. And so what America wants, America gets. Now, Trump isn't America. Trump is currently the president of America. But I think that's probably what they're trying to figure out in D.C.
Mm-hmm. So you and I have talked before, and consequently being able to have timing on our side, let's say when the pipelines blew up. We've gone through this idea of Europe's energy crisis. And, by a lot of metrics, Europe is in a lot worse shape than the US is fiscally. So how are they going to be able to manage, a lack of energy, or at least unpredictable energy, coupled with this debt situation and possibly needing to re-arm?
Yeah, I think, we wrote a piece called Project Porcupine, which, the social preview was assessing the fantasy of an EU military surge. Look, I think they don't have the jewels, but they don't have the energy to meaningfully rearm without radically crushing the rest of their economies, because they have, I think we put in that piece, they consume 40 exajoules a year of hydrocarbon energy. The 27 nation states that compose the European Union, which notably excludes the UK and Norway, those 27 states consume 40 exajoules of energy, but they only produce 6 exajoules of hydrocarbon energy. So they have to import every year 34 exajoules of hydrocarbon energy, oil, natural gas, and coal. 34 exajoules of energy, just to give our listeners a sense of the scale, is a huge amount of energy. It's the equivalent of the entire US natural gas production. And they're paying the full cost of capital for everybody in the supply chain that delivers those joules to the continent. And so by definition, their industry is at a huge disadvantage, and it's deindustrializing, and you can't print energy. They can print a lot of euros, and I think they will. And some of those euros will be diverted to keep the military industrial complex in the US happy. But in the end, I don't think the European Union is going to field an army, a navy, and an air force that anybody is going to be afraid of. Poland has a pretty strong, for obvious reasons, pretty strong military. But the UK today has 75,000 troops in its army. I saw a report, they spend 2.3% of GDP on the military in the UK, but almost all of that is in maintenance of its nuclear weaponry and in pensions for retired soldiers. It's not really spent on active duty kinetic militaries in the way that we think about it. And the UK is executing complete energy suicide, asking Germany to hold its beer. And it's just not going to happen, right? The last 2 times a British aircraft carrier was meant to participate in NATO exercises, it couldn't because its propeller wasn't working. The chasm between the flexing of Sir Keir Starmer, and the reality is just profound, and it's really one of the great mysteries of our time. Why Macron and Starmer think that France and Britain are still France and Britain, that anybody cares what they think, to put it bluntly. If Britain sends 10,000 soldiers into Ukraine over the objections of Russia, what are they going to do when they get destroyed? Go to war with Russia? Okay. So we're going to go to war with Russia, which is going to trigger a nuclear conflict. Are we prepared to have nuclear war over the Donbass? This has always been the open question of the Ukraine war. And it's very clear that the US, Biden even didn't want to escalate to that levels. And Trump certainly doesn't want to. And so are the British going to engage in nuclear war with Russia? This is the question. I would take the under on that. So I don't really get it. When I hear Starmer talking about the British military going into operational phase and boots on the ground in Ukraine, when the Russians have repeatedly said that any foreign troops that cross into Ukraine will be treated as enemy combatants. I mean, if they warn you, the escalation is sending them. And so it's really amazing to watch. I don't know what universe the British and the French are living in, but it's not this one.
That's again a generous way to put it. I think it's so, when we understand the reality of the situation, it's beggars belief to try to figure out why this posturing is taking place.
I was reminded of a cartoon that I saw must have been in the Globe and Mail a couple of decades ago it's called Canadian Military Might, and it had a picture of a plane, and under that plane it said "might fly," and it had a picture of a tank, and under the tank it said "might shoot," and it had a picture of a boat, and under the boat it said "might float." The British military might is an oxymoron, and look, that's fine. That's a national decision. You have allowed your industry to decay. Mm-hmm. War is terrible, but it's not like it's one thing to have. And look, I'm sure there are many brave soldiers in the British military, and it's not to denigrate any of them, but in aggregate, I think I saw that they have something like 40 operable tanks. What are we doing here? And by the way, the strongest army in Europe outside of the Russian one is the Ukrainian army. They've been fighting the Russians for 3 years, performing far better than I think the Russians would have expected. And so, it's just fascinating to watch.
Well, I think this way of thinking also, maybe not, these particular considerations, but, you brought up the idea of Trump basically wanting war with Iran right now. And this doesn't seem to make any sense either. So could this be about energy? Could it be about power projection? Like, what do you think is important there to consider in order to be able to wrap our heads around the possible outcomes of that?
It's not something we've given a whole lot of thought to, mostly because I suppose we're hoping it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. I think war with Iran would be a catastrophe for the U.S. It'd be great if we could go a couple of years without being entangled in a new war. Who knows? Maybe there's some grand bargain between the Saudis and the U.S. and the Russians. And the Saudis have long been adversarial towards Iran, although I thought that relationship was thawing in the past couple of years. Who knows? Iran and China and Russia seem to be pretty well aligned. Maybe Trump is escalating with Iran as a form of theater to allow Putin to broker a peace deal, and so the grand bargain seems more valuable. We took our lumps in Ukraine, but we've now we've scared Iran into giving up its nuclear program, and Russia is going to validate that they have, and who knows? It seems inconsistent with Trump's desire to keep energy prices low, and so I don't honestly know. It's not something that I can quite understand. And by the way, there's relatively recent developments, to be fair. He has been bellicose about Iran, but oftentimes Trump says things that you should just ignore. But it seems like there's a purposeful plan to escalate, and all of the wrong people are getting excited about it, and so that does give us pause.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of brings me to this other idea of basically what we haven't touched on is China in this entire situation, in this entire global way of thinking about it. BRICS has basically been taken out of almost all of the headlines. Do you think this is something that is still moving forward, that is, this shift to a more multipolar world is still something that the US and us as amateur analysts need to keep in the back of our mind still?
So to brainstorm with you in real time, I do note with interest the following two facts. Iran is a major exporter of oil to China. Mm-hmm. And I read this morning, not sure how true it is, that Xi Jinping is coming to the US. for a visit with Trump. So maybe the saber rattling is posturing ahead of some negotiation with China where Trump has some broader ambition that he wants to achieve. Should Xi Jinping show up in D.C.?
Mm-hmm.
So again, not always as they seem, but that would certainly connect two dots.
Yeah, it's such a complex world, such a complex web of, never ending conflict that, we're only going to see the remains of once it's negotiated.
Yeah, again, history is always filled with, I note with interest the latest frenzy around the release of the JFK files, for example, right? I mean, nothing about that event actually occurred as it was described for decades in traditional media outlets. And I think here we are, 60 years later, and there's still slow rolling truth from the American people. Like back to our piece about Carney and European frenzies, all frenzies are whipped up. I mean, the propaganda machines are very, very powerful. One of the most interesting intellectual journeys for us about the Ukraine war, for example, has been we made a decision about 15 months ago that we wanted to understand the true dynamics of that war far better than we did. And one of the ways that we did that was we proactively read the propaganda of all of the sides. And it's fascinating to see how events are portrayed. It's the exact same events portrayed radically differently, depending on which side of the war you're on. Mm-hmm. And there are ways to sort of balance that, and you get a sense for whose propaganda is worse. And so over time, you developed independent, open source intelligence ways to figure out what you believe to be is truly going on. But it's never as it seems, so I don't know why it would be any different this time. And in fact, I think it would be foolish to assume that whatever we're being fed as a narrative has anything to do with reality. Now, it's hard to live that way. I mean, you have to believe some things to be true just to function in society. And so, but the big things, I think you'd be prudent to be cautious to just swallow whatever you're being told.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny that you bring that up because I've been having this conversation for quite a while, and Grant Williams actually brought it up on one of his recent podcasts too. And I think as content creators, we're especially sensitive to this idea that most of the population doesn't want to or doesn't have the ability to be able to hold two competing ideas in their head at the same time. If you have a guest on, or if I have a guest on that says one thing that a particular person doesn't like, the consumer of that information just writes that person off completely, leaves a nasty comment and says, this isn't worth listening to whatsoever. And this is, as you bring up this idea of competing propaganda, I don't think it's ever been more difficult to really try to figure out what the truth actually is. The idea that history is written by the victors is something that I think we all need to keep in mind. And as we try to navigate this space of propaganda from any and all sides, we need to be able to triangulate off of many different sources of information to try to layer this picture of truth together based on more information than just one propaganda source.
Yeah, you make a series of very great points there that I would like to address. So first of all, as content creators, our objective is to be correct. We're not always correct, but our audience knows that we 100% believe whatever it is that we say are right the moment we say or write them. And then, we have a mistake management protocol, which is mistakes should be rare, admitted to, corrected, and learned from. So we authentically believe what we write, and it might not please some people. And we have come to understand that you can't make a living online without being prepared to have a bunch of people you've never met say very bad things about you. It just comes with the territory. Mm-hmm. And we know, through experience now, that if we wanted to create a phony red meat clickbait operation, we would be very successful at it. That's not what Doomberg is. It's not the kind of work we want to do. It would be far more lucrative for us to do that, to engagement harvest on every issue. Mm-hmm. It's really a solved problem. And I do, in a perverse way, admire the skills of the people that I observe doing that incredibly well. They are making far more money than sort of anybody who's trying to find the objective truth. Now, that's not to say that we're occupying some moral high ground. It's just not the kind of work we want to do. And I'm far more interested in trying to sift through all of the noise and isolate the signal. Mm-hmm. It's fun work. And I think we've built a big enough business of people who trust that that's what we are objectively trying to do, that when somebody listens to this full hour of you and I discussing things and hones in on one thing that I said or you said, and that makes them shut down, well, those people are never going to be long-term subscribers to Doomberg anyway, so what do I care what they say? Mm-hmm. I do care a lot about the people who are parting ways with their hard-earned money to support our efforts, and we do listen very keenly to what our paying customers say, and that's why we closed our comment section to paying customers only, by the way, which was the best move we could have done. The signal to noise in that comment section is incredible. You do run the risk of echo chamber, and mm-hmm. that's fine. I mean, we know that. That's a small price to pay compared to the signal to noise purity that we are able to achieve by doing so. So again, given our objective and what we want to do, the moment we become afraid of annoying a small but loud portion of the population, well, the whole edifice of the brand collapses. And so mm-hmm. we would never do that. So that's the way we think about it. We're not afraid to write what we believe to be true. And we trust that there's enough people that still think that's valuable in today's media landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that echo chamber problem is a lot easier to correct for than just having, oodles of people telling you that you're wrong and they hate you because you have the analysis, the audacity to write something that they might disagree with.
Well, I think, and sometimes our paying subscribers get annoyed with what we write. And mm-hmm. By the way, I personally read and respond to every comment, at least for the first 2 days after publication. But at that point, we're on to the next one. And I'm not afraid to say, and have said on many occasions, like, it's okay to occasionally read something you disagree with, mm-hmm. even here.
It's not fatal. Right.
And by the way, I read the Kiev Independent and I read TASS, mm-hmm. the Russian news agency. I'd like to see what the Ukrainians are telling themselves. Oftentimes, you get closer to the truth than if you just read the New York Times or if you just read Doomberg. We kind of view our role as distilling those sources into something that we believe to be true. But at least people know that when we hit send, we believed it in that moment. Mm-hmm. And that's all we can offer our brand.
Doomberg, maybe wrapping up here, how do you deal with or think about this idea of basically the treadmill that you and I both face here? It doesn't matter how great this conversation in particular was, we move on right away as soon as it's finished and have to, keep creating, keep having something for our audiences to consume. How do you think about that?
It's a real problem if you let it become one. We've published over 360 pieces now in 4 years, mm-hmm. which basically means we have to conceive, research, write, edit, publish, promote, and defend a piece every 4 days, mm-hmm. Without sacrificing quality. Because this is a cutthroat business. It's a competitive business. And, plenty of people have studied what we've done and are beginning to replicate it and improve upon it. In our view, this is the work of our lives. And some people get on the treadmill every day because they like to exercise. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy it. It is what I personally was meant to do. And if you're blessed enough to have found what you were meant to be doing in life, well, I mean, for heaven's sake, just keep doing it. And so if we could only publish 4 high-quality articles a month instead of 8 to 9 that we're kind of averaging, then we would only publish 4 high-quality articles a month, and we would accept the drop in revenue that would come from producing less content. I mean, we're in the business broadly speaking, the more you produce, the better you do as a business. It's just true. The more pieces we publish, assuming they're all of good quality, the more chances one goes viral, the more chances one gets forwarded and new customers show up and you beat back churn for a day or a week or a month. And this is a churn business, as you know.
Yeah.
But you can't really authentically do it if you don't love it. And I 360 articles in, I still love it. I have no problem finding the motivation to write the next piece when I get off with you. I'm going to work on the next piece, which is going to make what I hope is a powerful case that the U.S. is nowhere near peak production of natural gas, contrary to what the latest round of calamitous thinking might have some people believe. And I want to make that case, and I want to put it out there, and then I want to come back on your podcast and defend it. And it's fun, and I want to learn. And every piece we do, every doom zoom we make, we're doing a great doom zoom for our pro tier for March called All You Can Eat, Oil and Gas in the Western Hemisphere. There's so much oil and gas in the Western Hemisphere, it'll blow your mind. Mm-hmm. And we're going to do a deep dive on that. And it's 60 slides long. I can't wait to put the track down and put it out to our pro tier subscribers. And so this business, as brutal as the quote treadmill is, and as hard as it can be to beat back churn, one thing it does do is it identifies who really loves it and who doesn't, because you can't do it for very long if you don't. And I do. I still do. Love the Doomberg brand. Biggest accomplishment of my life. Super grateful for our paying subscribers. And what a blessing. I get up every day and all I do is what I love. I mean, many people would complain about the creator treadmill. I'm not going to be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I definitely share your sentiments of the idea of, as I've put it for myself, I'm basically a professional researcher. I'm not a podcaster. I'm not a, any other label you might put on it. I get paid to learn and research these things because I do put a lot of preparation and a lot of research behind every interview, despite, the ability to just have a conversation that might seem easy. And I do feel very blessed to have that as well.
I mean, I will tell you this, and I'm not blowing smoke, as the phrase goes. I'm a guest on many podcasts, and you're one of the best in the business, and it shows. I'm always happy when you reach out because I know it's going to be a great discussion because you have done your homework and you're a really good interviewer. And I think your success is in no small part because A, you like doing it, and B, you're quite good at it. And so, congrats to you. And like you say, what a privilege it is to live a life doing this. I mean, you're not going to find me complaining about quote unquote having to do Doomberg. I get to do Doomberg,
yeah.
And I wake up every day thrilled to tackle the privilege.
Well, Doomberg, I want to thank you for an excellent conversation that I don't always get to have. Always excited to be able to speak with you and really throw some big ideas up and be able to chew through them. And I really appreciate the kind words that you gave me as well.
It's great to talk to you and talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Of course, for anybody that wants to read more of your guys' work, that's all available at doomberg.substack.com. Excellent place for some out of the box thinking that might challenge you. Doomberg, thanks so much for your time.
You bet.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.